Hello and welcome. In the previous section, we'll learn how we could query data using Entity Framework core. In this section, we can concentrate on manipulating the data in our database using Entity Framework. We will start by creating a WebAPI controller that will house our CRUD operations. We will proceed by learning how we can insert data into the database. Then we will update existing data in multiple tables from a single object graph. Finally, we will learn how we can delete the data that we create. Let's proceed to our first video, in which we will create our WebAPI controller with our CRUD operations. First of all, we need to create new controller. Then we need to inject our DbContext into it. And finally, we will test our controller by adding read functionality into it that will return a single person and also all people from our database. Let's jump into code. Using Entity Framework in the scenario in which we write web services, specifically ASP.NET Controller-based services, is one of the primary uses, if not really the main scenario, for use of EF Core. Before we jump to create web services, we're going to make a couple of minor changes to our project. First of all, in our startup, we commented out the code that creates the database every time we start up our project, so we can make our data stick. Then we need to make the same change we made before, which is update serialization setting to handle self-referenced object, which our person is. If we walk down the tree, is a self-referenced object graph. And also made a couple of changes to clean up some of the previous code we wrote when we created database structure. We changed alternate key to unique index because columns that participate in alternate key are not updatable in Entity Framework core, and we actually do want to update last name and first name. We also updated the column type to make sure we don't have any warnings when we use decimal places. Let's start by creating a new controller. We're going to right-click on a controller folder, which is just a convention, of course. Then we can pick WebAPI controller. And because we manipulate in person, we're going to stick to naming convention and call it persons controller, where persons is plural. Now we need to specify the route for our control. This route was automatically created for us in the beginning. We're going to update the code now to return some of our data. First of all, we're going to create a private variable that's going to hold our context, which we're going to call it context. Now we need to create a constructor, and in the constructor we're going to inject the context, which is our main context for our project, and we will simply set our private variable to the injectable, as so. Now let's create code that returns our data. First of all, we're going to change the return value of getAll method to iActionResult, which is a generic representation of HTTP response object. We're going to go ahead and explicitly specify the route to be just simply the same route as the main controller, which is /API/persons. Hence, we're going to put blank in there. Now, one thing we want to do is specify what data is actually returned. And there is an attribute called produces response type, which will let us specify exactly what we return purely for readability perspective. In this case, we're going to return IEnumerable of person info object that we created in the previous video using the projection. And then we can specify what code this response will return from HTTP perspective, and we're going to return OK, which is represented by 200. Now we need to get the data. Because we wrote that data before, I'm just simply going to copy our projection code and paste it in here. Now we just need to return the result and we're going to use the helper method that creates an OK response, and we're going to tell it which data to return. Now we just need to fix the typo because OK method has a small K letter in it. Now you notice that we're not using a synchronous API yet, and we will discuss that in subsequent videos. Now let's return a single person. And to do that, we will use the next method, which already has an ID in it. And we're going to copy the producer's response attribute so we can keep our data properly annotated. And in this case, we will actually return a full person object. If you recall, there is a method in Entity Framework that returns first available record that matches our condition, and that's the method we're going to use here. We're going to go to context, then people, then we're going to call include method as we learned before, so we can include our phones, because as one of our simple business use cases, we do want to return person with a list of phones, and we're going to go ahead and specify that. Then we simply want to take first available using first or default method that we also discussed previously. And in this case, we're going to specify a condition where person ID is equal to the value that is passed in, which is just ID. Now there is one small thing we want to do. What if an invalid ID was passed in? We want to tell the caller so. And in this case, we're simply going to return not found result, which is essentially 404 response code. Otherwise, we will return an OK result and pass in the data. Now we just need to change the return type to iAction result, and we're all done. Now let's test our code. To do that, we're going to drop out to command line, and if you remember the command, we're going to call .NET run, and this will start up our Kestrel server and start our software. And because our control is written, we should be able to call it in just a minute. Now that our server is up, let's switch to Postman, which is a utility for Windows that allows us to easily make HTTP calls. Now we're in Postman, and first of all, let's retrieve all people. We're gonna pick API/persons URL. This will give us person info objects for all the people we created in our previous example. And here's the list of all the people. Now let's see if we can retrieve a single person by adding a person ID to this URL and calling it again. And in this case, as you see, we also retrieved the phones and other properties that exist on person object. And if we wanted to verify that not found result works, we can pass in an invalid ID, and we are getting 404. That's all we want to do in this video.